The shim is still in my equipment locker. Small thing. A machined counter-rotation insert, maybe 3 inches long, threaded on one end. With a friction collar she added herself using a strip of grip tape and what looks like the spring from a ballpoint pen. It shouldn't work. By the manual it can't work. But I've held it in my hands 100 times since the DSV Carlin, turning it over under the light the way you turn over something you don't fully understand, and I keep arriving at the same place. She built this the night before, alone, in the gear locker at the stern, because she already knew what was going to go wrong. She documented it 4 years ago, in a protocol that was sitting in a sealed file 2 decks up, and nobody in that briefing room had read it. That's where I have to start. The Carlin was a forward dive support vessel, classified, running a coastal interdiction corridor in a theater I'm not going to name. 44 personnel aboard, 28 of us in the main briefing compartment on the morning of the operation. The compartment smelled of rebreather scrubber compound and fresh coffee, and the particular tension that builds in a small room when everyone knows the water is cold and the window is short. Colonel Voss ran the brief. He was a capable officer, technically sound, and he had the kind of confidence that comes from never having been wrong in front of people who mattered. He stood at the board with the CUB-D7 schematic behind him, the closed-circuit underwater breach protocol, document 7, and he walked us through the hull approach sequence like he'd written it himself. He hadn't. None of us knew who had. She was in the back row. I didn't know her name at the time, only that she'd come aboard the night before, under a joint command transfer that my dive coordinator described as administrative reshuffling. She was in a standard-issue coverall, no rank insignia beyond the basic tabs, and she had a manila classification supplement in her lap that she hadn't opened. She didn't open it because she didn't need it. She'd written what was inside. When Voss got to the silt surge mitigation section of the brief, she raised her hand. He acknowledged her without looking up from the board. She said, quietly, that the Cub D7 approach sequence had a documented failure mode on high silt substrates, that the package seating step required a counter-rotation modification to the placement collar if ambient silt density exceeded a threshold she then named, with a precision that made the man next to me shift in his seat. She said she had the documentation in her supplement and could provide it before we went in. Voss looked at her then. He looked at the supplement in her lap, and then at her face, and then back at the board. He said that the protocol had been validated at the joint command level and that she was welcome to submit her concerns through the appropriate channels after the operation. He told her that her assignment for the day was rear medevac coordination. He said she was the one who calls the ambulance after the real operators are done. He said it almost exactly that way, in front of 28 people. And he said it with the calm certainty of a man who has never in his career been handed the wrong document at the wrong moment. Then he moved on. I didn't say anything. I've sat with that for a long time. She nodded once and closed the supplement and put it under her chair. She didn't argue. She didn't look around the room to measure the reaction. She sat straight and listened to the rest of the brief with the same expression she'd had when she walked in, and when Voss dismissed us she stood, tucked the supplement under her arm, and walked toward the stern without a word to anyone. I had my primary team in the water by 0740, 4 divers, my best people, carrying a validated hull breach package designed to seat magnetically on the target vessel's lower stern section and initiate on a timed fuse. The approach was clean. Visibility was perhaps 4 meters, poor but workable in water I'd trained in before, and the current was manageable at depth. The first diver reached the hull at 0748 and began the placement sequence according to Cub D7, step by step, the way we'd rehearsed it 100 times in training pools with flat concrete bottoms, and no silt and no surge. At 0751, I got the hand signal from my surface relay, placement failure. The package wouldn't seat. The collar was spinning against the hull plating without catching, and my diver was fighting a silt surge that was coming up from the substrate in pulses, reducing contact pressure every time it crested. The silt in that corridor was fine-grained and dense, the kind that moves like slow smoke underwater and coats everything it touches. He tried again. Placement failure. I sent the second diver down. He worked the collar from a different angle, tried a slower approach, held steady through 2 surge cycles. Same result. The package turned in his hands without locking, the collar threads finding no purchase against the plating through the silt film. I was on the staging dock watching the relay clock. At 0810, I had 2 divers in the water burning gas on a repeated failure and no seated package. The operation window was 90 minutes total. We had used 30 of them. The breach team lead surfaced and gave me the flat look I knew meant he'd run out of ideas. I told him to hold position. I stood on the dock and looked at the clock and thought about the briefing room. I heard boots on the dock grating behind me. I turned. She had a rebreather unit on, fins in hand, the supplement gone. In its place, she had a mesh equipment satchel slung over one shoulder, and from it she'd pulled the shim, that machined counter-rotation insert, and was threading it onto the placement collar of a spare package she'd apparently rigged from the gear locker inventory. She was doing this without hurrying, without looking at me for permission, the way someone works when the math is already done, and all that's left is the physical execution. Her hands were steady. She wasn't checking her work the way a nervous person checks their work. She was checking it the way a person confirms what they already know to be correct. I said her name. She looked up. I asked her what she thought she was doing. She said she was going to seat the package. She said the silt surge was creating a clockwise rotation effect against the collar threads, and that a counter-rotation insert at 22-degree offset would allow the package to seat and lock in under 6 seconds of steady pressure. She said she'd built the insert last night from gear locker components because she'd anticipated this failure mode from the substrate survey data filed 2 weeks before the operation. She said it simply, without edge, and then she looked at me with an expression that was not defiant and not pleading. It was the expression of a person reporting a technical fact and waiting to see whether the person in front of them is going to make it complicated. I stood on that dock for what felt like a long time. It was probably 4 seconds. I thought about Colonel Voss in the briefing room saying, "Appropriate channels after the operation." I thought about my 2 best divers cycling through a failure mode for 20 minutes, because nobody had read what was in that supplement. I thought about the 22 personnel aboard the target vessel, and the clock on the staging dock that was not slowing down. I stepped back from the dock edge. She went in without a splash. Clean entry, fins level, no wasted motion, the satchel sealed and pressure rated against her side. I watched the surface close over her and looked at the relay clock. 4 minutes and 41 seconds. That's how long it took her. I've replicated that number in my head every time I've told this story, and it never changes. My best man had spent 40 minutes on the same hull section. She surfaced 4 minutes and 41 seconds after she went in, and when she gave the signal, it wasn't the flat failure look. It was one finger pointing down, and then a closed fist. Package seated. Lock confirmed. We initiated at 08:26. The breach opened in 8 seconds. 22 personnel came out through that hull in the next 11 minutes, moving through cold water in the dark by feel and light, and the sound of my team calling them through. And every one of them was alive when we pulled them aboard the Carlin. I helped the last one over the rail. I remember his weight, and the smell of the water, and the absolute quiet on the dock in the few seconds after, when the count was done and the number held. I didn't tell Voss about the shim until the operation was over, and the formal inquiry had already been convened. That was my own failure, and I'll own it. I could have told him the moment she surfaced. I chose not to, partly because there was no time, and partly because I understood, standing on that dock, that what had just happened needed to be seen whole, and not managed in pieces by people who hadn't seen it. The inquiry was held 6 days later aboard the Carlin in the main operations compartment, Admiral Harwick presiding. She sat at the long table with her supplement in front of her, the same manila jacket she'd tried to hand Voss in the briefing room. She didn't open it during the inquiry. She didn't need to. Harwick read from it. He read the silt surge failure mode section aloud, in full, including the counter-rotation insert specification and the threshold silt density figure she had named in the briefing. He read the substrate survey reference she had cited 4 years ago in the original protocol. He noted that the document was dated 4 years and 3 months prior to the operation, and that it bore her name as the originating author of the Cub D7 protocol in its entirety, not as a contributor, not as a reviewer, as the author. He set that page down and picked up a second document. He read Colonel Voss's Joint Command Validation Submission, filed 18 months after her protocol, which had recommended sealing her classification supplement on the basis that her safety objection was, and I am quoting the language Harwick read aloud, slowly, with no particular inflection, technically unsupported, and operationally disruptive. He read both documents in sequence, one after the other, without commentary. Then he closed the binder. He looked at Colonel Voss. He did not say anything. He simply looked, with the binder flat on the table and the room completely still, for what I counted as 11 seconds. That was all. I've been a combat diver for 22 years. I've sat in a lot of inquiry rooms. I know what one sounds like when the verdict is still forming, and I know what it sounds like when it's already done. Those 11 seconds were the second kind. The document said what it said. The shim seated the package in 441. 22 people were alive. There was nothing left to adjudicate. Voss had his hands flat on the table and he didn't speak. I don't know what he was thinking. I know what I was thinking. That 4 years ago someone had written the right answer down and put it in a supplement and handed it to a room, and the room had called her the ambulance caller and sent her to the stern, and 22 people had spent a week locked in a hull section waiting to find out if anyone in that room was going to catch up. She didn't look at him. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, with the same composure she'd had when he'd dismissed her, and I understood, watching her, that she had been carrying this for 4 years. Not the bitterness, not the injustice of it as a wound, but simply the knowledge of it, precise and documented, a thing she kept bringing to rooms where nobody opened the envelope. She had not once raised her voice. She had built the shim alone in the gear locker, and she had gone in without orders, and she had done the work, and she had let the document make every argument she was never given the floor to make herself. The shim is in my locker. I asked her, afterward, in the passageway outside the ops compartment, if she wanted it back. She said I could keep it. She said she'd build another one if she ever needed one, and the way she said it made clear she was not being generous with me. She was being accurate. I've kept it because it is the most honest thing I own. It works perfectly by principles the manual hadn't accounted for, and the reason it works is that the person who wrote the manual built it the night before an operation she'd been excluded from, alone, because she had already done the math, and she knew exactly what was going to happen at 0751 on that hull. She always knew. The supplement was 4 years old. We just never read it. I read everything now. Every page, every attachment, every sealed supplement that lands on my desk in a manila jacket, with a Joint Command review stamp on the front. Every one. It takes extra time. I have never once regretted it.